Lewis and Clark. If you're not here for this, you're in the wrong room. I laugh when I think that people who believe in small government and government doing less rather than more think of Thomas Jefferson as a patron saint, because here's a guy who not only did the Louisiana Purchase, but he chartered this first great expedition that we're going to hear about tonight. It was an incredible, exciting time for our country, opened up the entire West. I was just watching the slides, as I'm sure some of you were before it started, amazed at the natural beauty. A lot of those photographs were taken by tonight's speaker, Mark Jordan, and a lot of them are old historical stuff. I was particularly taken by the shot of the birch bark canoe plunging down the rapids, and there's one guy with a top hat on, and he's hanging on to it. And, I would encourage you to follow his example and hang on your hats, because I think we're going to have a really wild ride here tonight. Does anybody know the connection between Lewis and Clark and William Shakespeare? Raise your hand. The connection is tonight's speaker, Mark Jordan. Last time he was here to talk to us about Shakespeare on the 400th anniversary of Shakespeare's death. And but he's a polymath, and so now we get Lewis and Clark. If you don't learn enough tonight, pick up one of these outside, because in the fall, Mark is going to be doing a lecture series on Lewis and Clark, more about the Lewis and Clark expedition at Cal OSHA at the Cal State East Bay campus here in Concord. So anyway, I think with that, it's my pleasure to introduce, wherever he is, tonight's speaker, Mark Jordan.
Thank you. Yeah, I have to. Am I live? Yes, good. I'll just give you one of these or one of these. They didn't have these problems going up the river. They had a lot of problems, but not these. Okay, in 1801, Thomas Jefferson, a man who for many years looked to the west and dreamed of a northwest passage, the all-water route from the Atlantic to the Pacific, gets elected president. He chooses as his personal secretary a neighbor and family friend, the 28-year-old Meriwether Lewis. Okay. For 2 years, they have, you notice a similarity, for 2 years, they have nightly discussions about exploration. Then, in 1803, Lewis prepares a budget of $2,500 for an expedition up the Missouri River and down the Columbia Rivers, the last great hope for a north-northwest passage. And as an aside, that figure is only 7% of the actual cost of the expedition. So even Thomas Jefferson was a deficit spender. Okay. He submits the budget to Congress. Congress approves it. And then Jefferson issues the following instructions to Lewis. The object of your mission is to explore the Missouri River, its communications with the waters of the Pacific Ocean that may offer the most direct and practicable water communication across the continent for the purposes of commerce. Serendipitously, the Louisiana Purchase takes place within the same time frame and is completed just before the expedition embarks. So measuring the extent of the newly acquired territory becomes another goal of the expedition, as does cataloging information about the natives who live within that territory. Lewis is a superb frontiersman. Jefferson says of him, he is brave, prudent, habituated to the woods, possesses a great mass of, oh, you've got that. There you go, thank you, sorry. Possesses a great mass of accurate observation on all subjects of nature. Jefferson's Attorney General, Levi Lincoln, adds a cautionary note. For my ideas of Captain Lewis, he will be much more likely, in case of difficulty, to push too far than to recede too soon, and hopefully you'll see a few examples of that tonight. Jefferson essentially gives Lewis a blank check. They both anticipate that it will take 10 to 12 men to take care of the expedition. At Harper's Ferry, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and Philadelphia, Lewis obtains supplies that he needs for the expedition and receives instruction in the scientific disciplines that he needs to do on the expedition. And those include astronomy, botany, zoology, natural history, ethnography, and medicine. And if you don't think that was an enormous load for one man to carry, you're right. Supplies will include guns, powder, lead, tools, blankets, cloth, mosquito netting, food, and whiskey. Barrels of trade goods, and pen, ink, and paper. He quickly realizes that he will need more than 10 men. Lewis invites his old commander, William Clark, to join him on the expedition, June 19, 1803. If, therefore, there is anything in this enterprise which would induce you to participate with me in its fatigues, its dangers, and its honors, believe me, there is no man on earth with whom I should feel equal pleasure in sharing them as with yourself. I make this communication to you with the privity of the President, who expresses an anxious wish that you would consent to join me in this enterprise. Lewis offers Clark the rank of captain and a co-command, very rare, if not never. Clark replies by letter, July 18, 1803. The enterprise is such as I have long anticipated and am much pleased with. My friend, I do assure you that no man lives with whom I would prefer to take such a trip as yourself. Clark is also an excellent frontiersman, with more experience with the natives than Lewis has. He has a more even temper than Lewis and a sunnier disposition, and he is happy to get the promise of being captain. They are a perfect pair. They are perfect leaders. And for the entire journey, there is no evidence whatsoever of any dissension between them, and the men follow them religiously. Lewis arrives in Pittsburgh on July 15, 1803, where all the equipment has been shipped, and it's supposed to be loaded on a keelboat. Okay, so Lewis arrives in Pittsburgh on July 15th, where all the equipment has been shipped, and it's supposed to be loaded on this keelboat, which is designed originally to Lewis's specifications. But the keelboat isn't finished when he gets there. The builder is a drunk. He can't do it himself, and he can't keep workmen up. It takes Lewis 6 weeks to get the builder to finish the boat. Then, an aggravated and anxious Lewis leaves Pittsburgh on August 31st, working his way down the Ohio River. With him are 2 men who prove very important to the expedition, John Coulter and George Shannon. On October 15th, Lewis meets Clark in Louisville. Clark adds 7 men to the roster, including the Field brothers, who will be important, and John Shields, the indispensable blacksmith. So that with Coulter and Shannon, these men are known as the 9 young men from Kentucky. But this count omits one other person, Clark's slave, York, who endures all the hardships of the expedition, does all the things that is required of him of the expedition, travels the 8,000 miles with everybody else, and gets no reward and no recognition whatsoever at the end of the expedition for any of his work. They reach the Mississippi on November 13th and ascend to the mouth of the Missouri by the middle of December. Clark encamps the men, since increased by a significant number of recruits. Lewis heads off to St. Louis to continue supplying the expedition. Clark will train the men and redesign the boats so they're capable, and there are 3 boats now, capable of ascending the river. George Dreyer joins them. He will be the most valuable man on the expedition, other than the 2 captains, of course. He is a proficient hunter, he is a great scout, and he is proficient in the lingua franca of the plains, sign language. Then Lewis receives a terribly disappointing letter just before they're about to embark on the expedition. Clark does not receive his captaincy. He's made a 2nd lieutenant. Clark is not happy. But Lewis tells Clark that no one on the expedition will ever know that Clark is not a captain or the co-leader. Clark agrees to continue, and not once during the expedition is Clark recognized as anything other than captain and co-leader. In fact, it doesn't come out for about 8 years that Clark wasn't captain. On May 14th, the expedition starts. Set out at 4:00 p.m. and proceeded on under a gentle breeze up the Missouri to the upper point of the first island, 4 miles. The expedition consists of 2 captains, 25 soldiers, a secondary contingent of 6 soldiers, and 8 engagés, French boatmen, all responsible for propelling the boat up the river. The expedition is outfitted with 3,400 pounds of flour, 3,750 pounds of corn and cornmeal, 50 kegs of salt pork, 750 pounds of salt, 560 pounds of biscuits, 112 pounds of sugar, 50 pounds of coffee, 100 pounds of lard, 600 pounds of grease, whatever that was, I won't tell you, 74 additional bushels of corn and cornmeal, a portable dehydrated soup, and 120 gallons of whiskey. And that's only a partial list. How do we know so much about the expedition? The journals. Lewis and Clark keep journals, as do some of the men. They record their daily activities in varying levels of detail. We will see much of the expedition through their eyes. And those are pages from the journals. Next. And there you see, there's the route up the Missouri River from St. Louis, which is cut off on the lower right-hand corner there, up to just about where they're going to spend the first winter. On May 23rd, their 9th day out, Captain Lewis has just joined them 2 days ago. Captain Lewis ascended the cliffs, which is at the said cave, 300 feet high, hanging over the water. Captain Lewis near fallen from the peninsula of rocks 300 feet. He caught at 20 foot. Okay, first of all, he stopped himself with a knife. But this is all you get from the journals. There's this incredible story. He almost dies his second day into the expedition, and that's the brief we get to the journals, one of their weaknesses. On May 24th, the next day, very bad part of the river, we attempted to pass up under the larboard bank, which was falling in so fast that the evident danger obliged us to cross the sandbar and run on the sand. The swiftness of the current wheeled the boat, broke our tow rope, and was nearly oversetting the boat. All hands jumped out on the upper side and bore on that side until the sand washed from under the boat and wheeled on the next bank. By the time she wheeled a third time, got a rope fast to her stern, and by the means of swimmers was carried to shore. Okay, 10 days out, and they almost lose the keel boat and all the stuff that I just read to you that was in the keel boat, which would, of course, fundamentally kill the expedition. The river will continue to present many, many similar challenges as they ascend. The river is muddy, full of debris, composed of sand, silt, runs wild, lacks any semblance of channels. Occasionally, go ahead, there we go. Occasionally the boats would hoist a sail. That's a full-size reconstruction of the keel boat. Go ahead, next one. And these are the two smaller boats. They're called pirogues, the white pirogue and the red pirogue. Occasionally, you can go to the next slide. Occasionally, the boats could hoist a sail, but locomotion was mainly by the oars, setting poles, that's where you put the pole in the water and you move it forward, or the tow rope where they'd get out and in the water or on the bank, pull the boat up the river. Lots of fun. July 19th, came suddenly into an open and boundless prairie. I say boundless because I could not see the extent of the plain in any direction. Clark enters the Great Plains. Long grasses as far as the eye could see and further, and wildlife beyond imagination. Badger, bull snake, porcupine, beaver, wild turkey, rattlesnakes, plenty of rattlesnakes, egrets, red foxes, elk, deer, coyotes, prairie dogs, wolves, pronghorn, jackrabbits, and bison. Enormous herds of bison. And the natives. Lewis prepares a long speech, roughly 2,500 words, which has to be translated either by a native speaker, which would be Druyer, who was one, Pierre Cruzat, who was responsible for guiding the boats up the river, would have been another, or by sign language. It is a condescending speech that treats the natives like children. It does not offer them what they want, which are primarily guns, ammunition, tools, metal tools, and whiskey. Very popular item. No one drank water then, by the way. They are not interested in someone else's claim to sovereignty. Having been warned about the Sioux, which is one of the warlike tribes on the Missouri, they pick up a Sioux translator by the name of Old Dorian. They first encounter the Yankton Sioux, which is a relatively peaceful tribe, and all goes smoothly with the translation. The Sioux camps are, you can go to the next slide, handsome, of a conic form, covered with buffalo robes, painted different colors, and all compact and handsomely arranged. And there's a relatively contemporary painting of that. Lewis and Clark leave Dorian with the Yankton, which is a huge mistake because next they're going to encounter the Teton Sioux, Lakota Sioux, the Sioux who killed Custer, the bullies of the Missouri. But before then, Sergeant Charles Floyd dies. He is the only expedition member who dies during the course of the expedition. Okay. August 19th, Sergeant Floyd is taken violently bad with a belliose colic and is dangerously ill. Nature appear exiting fast in him. Every man is attentive to him, York principally. August 20th, Floyd died with a great deal of composure. We buried him on the top of the bluff. He probably had a ruptured appendix, which he would have died regardless. There was nothing anybody or scientific medicine could have done for him at the time. They recover a lost man, George Shannon, who is, right now, the youngest member of the expedition. Here the man who left us with the horses 22 days ago joined us nearly starved to death. He had been 12 days without anything to eat but grapes and one rabbit, which he killed by shooting a piece of hard stick in place of a ball. He became weak and feeble. Thus a man had like to have starved to death in a land of plenty for the want of bullets or something to kill his meat. The aggressive Tetons control traffic on the Missouri. Okay, get the next one. Okay. Lewis and Clark first boldly announce when they meet him, "We are not afraid of any Indians." Lewis starts his speech, but lacking a translator, he stops. Then they invite several chiefs on board their boat. They give them whiskey. Questionable idea. After the chiefs sucked the bottle after it was out, they became troublesome, apparently feigning drunkenness. Clark escorts them to shore, and just as they reach the bank, 3 warriors grab the pirogue's cable. One chief hugs the mast, and another becomes very insolent both in words and gestures, declaring I should not go on, stating he had not received presents sufficient. Okay, Clark draws his sword, orders the men on his boat to arms. Lewis orders the men on the keelboat to arms. The cannon on the keelboat is loaded with musket balls. The blunderbusses on the pirogues are loaded with shot. The Indians take out their arrows and notch them in their bows. They draw them. There's a tense moment. Then one chief takes the rope from his men and orders the warriors away. The tension dissipates. Interestingly, Clark takes the chiefs back on board the boat and they proceed upriver. The Tetons persuade them to spend the evening with them in the Teton camp. Lewis and Clark are escorted into the Teton camp to the council house on these large buffalo robes they're carried like royalty. In there, the Tetons put on great entertainment, including, interestingly enough, a war dance. And the men are offered women, which they apparently decline. 2 days later, as they are about to set out, warriors grab the cable again. The chief demands tobacco. Lewis refuses. The warriors are ready. They're pulling their arrows out. The corpsmen are ready. They're loading their guns. But then Clark grabs some tobacco, throws it down to the feet of the chief, and the chief takes the cable from the men and gives it back to Cruzat. Then they proceed upriver, but always keeping a wary eye out on what's going on around them. But here we see how Clark tempers Lewis's impetuosity. By the end of October, the river is low and about to ice over. You're going to go there. That's good. So they stop for the winter at the Mandan and Hadats, at the villages where the Mandans and Hadatses live. You can go to the next one too. The Mandan Hidatsa villages, which are near Pierce, Bismarck, North Dakota, are the center or the nexus of all the trade networks carried on by the Native Americans in the Americas. And they travel in each direction, hundreds of miles, if not thousands of miles, in each direction. The tribes are repositories of information about all the landscape that's surrounding them in all directions. So Lewis and Clark will gather as much information as they can about them and what lies in front of them. They erect, Fort Mandan, and will spend the winter mostly inside, though they will hunt bison and attempt to go on raiding parties. They're ostensibly on a peace mission. They will experience temperatures dropping to 40 below zero. On November 4th, A Frenchman by name as Charbonneau, who speaks the Big Belly language, visit us. He informed us his two squaws were Snake Indians. We engaged him to go on with us and take one of his wives to interpret the Snake language. Snake is Shoshone, by the way. The wife they select is a 16-year-old girl, herself with a big belly. She's 6 months pregnant. Her name is Sacagawea, also known as Sacagawea, and she will become the third most well-known member of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Unable to secure adequate food during the winter, the two blacksmiths, John Shields and Alexander Willard, run a smithy to create weapons to trade with the Mandans and the Hidatsa, although, again, ostensibly, it's a peace mission. Lewis and Clark spend the winter preparing their materials, information for Jefferson. Lewis his notes, Clark his map, and that volume at the end there shows all the maps that Clark produced. Terrific map maker. The men, meanwhile, have plenty of opportunity to socialize during the winter with the Mandan women. Then, on February 11th, 1805, there we go, about 5 o'clock this evening, one of the wives of Charbonneau was delivered of a fine boy. Her labor was tedious and the pain violent. Mr. Zersom informed me that he had frequently administered a small portion of the rattle of the rattlesnake, which he assured me had never failed of hastening the birth of the child. Having the rattle of a snake by me, I gave it to him, and he administered 2 rings of it to the woman, broken in small pieces and added to a small quantity of water. I was informed that she had not taken it more than 10 minutes before she brought forth. Science in action. Sacagawea gives birth to Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau. As the ice breaks up, preparations are made to set forth. All the material and data gathered on the way up is loaded in boxes, loaded on the keelboat, and ultimately delivered to President Jefferson, including a live prairie dog and magpie. On April 7th, the Corps heads off into the unknown, and Lewis rhapsodizes. Our vessels consisted of 6 small canoes and 2 large pirogues. This little fleet, although not quite so respectable as those of Columbus or Captain Cook, was still viewed by us with as much pleasure as those deservedly famed adventurers ever beheld theirs, and I dare say with quite as much anxiety for their safety and preservation. We were now about to penetrate a country at least 2,000 miles in width, on which the foot of civilized man had never trodden, and these little vessels contained every article by which we were to subsist and defend ourselves. The party are in excellent health and spirits, and anxious to proceed, all act with the most perfect harmony. Next slide. The Corps consists of the following men. The captains, Lewis and Clark, George Dreyer, very important man, York, Clark's slave, the 3 sergeants, there's Shannon on there, next page. Those are the rest of the troops there. You see on there, of course, Toussaint Charbonneau, who is Sacagawea's husband. Sacagawea, who is 16 years old. Don't forget that. 16 years old. And her baby, who is 2 months old. When people say Sacagawea didn't do very much, think about that. How many 16-year-old daughters carrying their babies are going to be traipsing across the country like she did? An amazing feat. Oh, yes, and one more. Lewis's dog, Seaman. He goes on the entire expedition as well. They proceed upriver, armed with information they obtained from the natives and from Canadian traders who lived in the Mandan villages during the winter as well. They had a good idea of what to expect and a not unreasonable idea of where to expect it, but how accurate is the information. They sail, okay, next slide. They sail, paddle, pole, and tow the boats upriver. There you can see the setting poles. They have no idea how bad it's going to get. They pass one significant locale, the confluence with the Yellowstone River, Missouri and the Yellowstone coming together. This will play an important role on the return journey. Next slide. They pass the White Cliffs. The hills and river cliffs which we pass today exhibit a most romantic appearance. It seemed as if those scenes of visionary enchantment would never have an end. So perfect indeed are those walls that I should have thought that nature had attempted here to rival the human art of masonry, had I not recollected that she had first begun her work. Now, joy at this wonder is short-lived, because here begins a breakdown in the information that they got from the Hidatsa. They reach a fork that the Hidatsa had not described. The river on the right, looks exactly like the Missouri. It's muddy, same width. The river on the left, or the fork on the left, runs clear and rapid. A decision has to be made. They know the Great Falls of the Missouri is on the fork that they need to go on, but they don't know which one of the forks to go on. Clark explores the left fork. Lewis explores the right fork. And neither one of them, in their explanation, come upon the Great Falls. Every one of the men, including Cruzat, who's the most knowledgeable riverman, thinks that the right fork, and that's the left side of the screen there, the right fork is the Missouri. But Lewis and Clark say, no, we're taking the left fork. They leave the mysterious river behind. They name it the Marias and go on ahead. In 2 days, next slide. I saw the spray, Lewis goes on ahead. I saw the spray arise above the plain like a column of smoke, which soon began to make a roar and too tremendous to be mistaken for any cause short of the Great Falls of the Missouri. I hurried down the hill to gaze on this sublimely grand spectacle. Lewis is ecstatic, one, that they had made the right choice, but he's overwhelmed by the fall's majesty. I wish that I might be enabled to give the enlightened world some just idea of this truly magnificent and sublimely grand object, which has from the commencement of time been concealed from the view of civilized man. And there's a photograph of the Great Falls long before it was dammed. He goes to look for the best path around the falls, and he is stunned. The Hidatsa state that there is a fine open plain on the north side of the falls, through which canoes and baggage may be readily transported. This portage, they assert, is not greater than half a mile. Lewis then discovers, next slide, next slide, next slide, that there are 4 large falls above the Great Falls. And he's, of course, again stunned. He returns below the first falls to meet Clark. And that's where they'll stop. The canoes in gear must be portaged along the south side of the river as the Missouri bent around the falls to the south. Next slide. And so, just to give you an idea, there's the creek that you just saw is the top right. Missouri comes down. You can see the locations where the falls were. And then you can see how the Missouri then drops going straight south. So they have to portage on the south side of the river. They are faced with this great portage and with Sacagawea being ill. Lewis gives her water from a nearby sulfur spring. If you saw the slide, so you saw the spring. I wouldn't drink the water if somebody paid me. And she gradually recovers. Meanwhile, Clark determines that the portage, go back again a second, okay? The portage is going to cover 18 miles, and you can see them going across there. They construct wagons and spars using cotton. They use spars and then the masts of the boat and cottonwood wheels. Then they put the canoes on the wagons. They fill the canoes with gear, and the men are going to pull them along the prairie, and that's the prairie there that they're pulling them along. 18 miles of that, with, of course, great effort and exposure. The exertion was so great that when they would stop for a rest on the trail, they would fall asleep immediately. The other problem, there were lots of problems, but one other problem, the prairie is covered with prickly pear, and they're constantly stepping on prickly pear with their thin moccasins. It was not a lot of fun. On June 29th, I perceived a cloud, this is Clark, I perceived a cloud which threatened immediate rain. I observed a deep ravine in which was shelving rocks under which we took shelter. Soon after, a torrent of rain and hail fell more violent than ever I saw before, and gave us time only to get out of the way of a torrent of water, taking with it large rocks and mud. I took my gun in my left hand and with the right scrambled up the hill, pushing the interpreter's wife, who had her child in her arms, before me. Before I got out of the bottom, the water was up to my waist. I scarcely got out before it raised 10 feet deep, and by the time I reached the top of the hill, at least 15 feet water. I directed the party to return to the camp at the run to get clothes to cover the child, whose clothes were all lost, and the woman who was but just recovering from a severe indisposition, and all wet and cold. Same day on the portage trail. The party had just returned in great confusion, leaving their loads in the plain. The hail and wind being so large and violent, and them naked, they were much bruised, and some nearly killed. One knocked down 3 times, and others without hats or anything on their heads, bloody. But if they thought things were bad, things got worse on July 4th. They ran out of the last of their whiskey. Now for an interlude. Grizzly bears. Okay, first impressions of the grizzly bear. Lewis. These are all by Lewis. The Indian may well fear this animal, equipped as they are with their bows and arrows, but in the hands of skillful riflemen they are by no means as formidable or dangerous as they have been represented. Opinions change. Next slide. Okay. In the evening, the men discovered a large brown bear. 6 of them went out to attack him. 4 fired nearly at the same time. In an instant, this monster ran at them with open mouth. The 2 who had reserved their fires discharged their pieces. Both of them struck him. This only retarded his motion. The men, unable to reload, took to flight. The bear pursued and had very nearly overtaken them before they reached the river. 2 betook themselves to a canoe, and the others concealed themselves among the willows, reloaded their pieces, each discharged his piece. The guns served only to direct the bear to them. He pursued 2 of them so close that they were obliged to throw themselves into the river, although the bank was nearly 20 feet perpendicular. So enraged was this animal that he plunged into the river only a few feet behind, when one of those who still remained on shore shot him through the head and finally killed him. Next slide. All right, the last grizzly bear encounter. McNeil surprised a white bear in the thick brush. The horse threw him immediately. This animal raised himself on his hind feet for battle and gave McNeil time to recover. With his musket, he struck the bear over the head. The bear fell to the ground and began to scratch his head. This gave McNeil time to climb a willow tree. Grizzly bears don't climb trees. The bear waited at the foot of the tree until late in the evening before he left him, when McNeil ventured down and caught his horse. And in summary, these bears are a most tremendous animal. It seems that the hand of Providence has been most wonderfully in our favor with respect to them, or some of us would long since have fallen a sacrifice to their ferocity. Luck is something that stays with the Lewis and Clark expedition from beginning to end. Next one. And there you see McNeil up the willow tree. The Great Falls portage costs them a month of travel and raises the stakes in reaching the Shoshone. They need Shoshone horses to cross from the Missouri watershed to the Columbia watershed, where they anticipate a real quick and easy float down to the Pacific Ocean. They continue up the, nope, not the back one. They continue up the Missouri River, then, the next one, and then pass through what Lewis describes as the gates of the mountains, entering only one of several ranges that make up the Rockies. Lewis had expected, like most people in the world, that the western range of mountains was a mirror image of the eastern range of mountains. On reaching the Three Forks, next one. On reaching the Three Forks, Sacagawea begins to identify landmarks familiar to her. She had been kidnapped by the Hidatsa 5 years before. Lewis notes of her. Sacagawea was one of the female prisoners taken, though I cannot discover that she shows any emotion of sorrow in recollecting this event, or of joy in being again restored to her native country. If she has enough to eat and a few trinkets to wear, I believe she would be perfectly content anywhere. Okay, watch for her reaction when she's reunited with the Shoshone. At the Three Forks, the Corps takes the westernmost stream, which they call the Jefferson. Now here's where 2 of the Three Forks are. The left one's the Madison. The right one is the Jefferson. And this time of year, it's swift and shallow. The men drag the canoes up the river. Okay. All right, just a quick look at where they're going from here. So they've come down the Missouri to the Three Forks. The Missouri branches off. The Gallatin goes that way. The Madison runs into Yellowstone National Park. They come down to what's shown as Twin Bridges. The river divides again. They pick up the Beaverhead. They come down to Camp Fortunate, and then ultimately over the pass here. So that's what we're going to be going in the next few minutes. So the men drag the canoes up the river. Next slide. They're coming into the mountains here, and then they pass through more country that Sacagawea identifies for them, the Beaverhead Rock, but still no Shoshone. By the second week of August, Lewis is terribly frustrated. Next slide. We begin to feel considerable anxiety with respect to the Snake Indians. If we do not find them, I fear the successful issue of our voyage will be very doubtful. However, I still hope for the best and intend taking a tramp myself in a few days to find these yellow gentlemen. He sets out ahead of the canoes with Dreyer, McNeil, and Shields. And that's where the Beaverhead forks into Horse Prairie Creek. So Lewis takes the right one, Horse Prairie Creek, which then turns into Trail Creek, next one, and goes ascending up into the mountains. So Lewis is going up this trail, following the creek there. As Lewis nears the ridge, he sees a native mounted on a horse. Lewis approaches him, tries to entice the native by waving trinkets in the air and shouting the words "Ta ba bone," which Lewis thinks means white man, and which probably meant enemy, or at worst, stranger, or at best, stranger, probably. The horseman advances to within several hundred yards, but seeing Shields continue to move on his flank, he turns around and runs back off up into the mountains, and Lewis is furious at Shields. 2 days later, they reach the headwaters of the Missouri. Yeah, that's the headwaters. Then, next slide. The road took us to the most distant fountain of the waters of the mighty Missouri, in search of which we have spent so many toilsome days and restless nights. And there's a lighthearted moment as McNeil performs what seems to be a ritual. McNeil exultantly stood with a foot on each side of this little rivulet and thanked his God that he had lived to bestride the mighty and heretofore deemed endless Missouri. Next slide. And there you see McNeil. That's the only picture left from the expedition, striding the headwaters of the Missouri. Next slide. At the top of Lemhi Pass, Lewis, who had hoped for an easy ride down the waters of the Columbia, over terrain similar to what they had just come through, is stunned to see nothing but continuous ranges of mountains. The four men hike down into the valley, where they encounter several groups of Shoshone. The first group flees. They come upon the second group of women who, seeing the strangers, kneel, fearing they're about to be executed. Lewis plays conciliator, gives them gifts. Shortly thereafter, mounted warriors come and surround them. But the women act as peacemakers, and the Shoshone exuberantly embrace the newcomers. Next slide. These men then advanced and embraced me very affectionately by putting their left arm over your right shoulder, clasping your back while they apply their left cheek to yours. We were all caressed and besmeared with their grease and paint till I was heartily tired of the national hug. Lewis is able to grasp some basic information. Indeed, they are on the Columbia watershed. But the river they see, the Lemhi, flows into another river, the Salmon, and the Salmon is impassable to boat or horse. The Salmon's nickname is the River of No Return, which I have boated, by the way, and I've returned. Lewis urges the reluctant Shoshone to follow him back over the Lemhi Pass with horses. The Shoshone fear a trap. All the tribes in the area would attack each other. And of course, the Hidatsa had attacked them and taken Sacagawea. After much persuasion, they accompany Lewis and wait for Clark to arrive at the Beaverhead Forks, Camp Fortunate, which we saw earlier, a couple of slides. After a horrible time of ascending the river, Clark and his men appear. All they're doing is dragging boats in the water. They drag it on the shore, but there's so much brush on the shore that they can't bring it up. So on August 17th, the party reunites, and communication is easier. Next slide. It works like this. Lewis speaks English to Labiche. Labiche speaks French to Charbonneau. Charbonneau speaks Hidatsa to Sacagawea, and Sacagawea speaks Shoshone to the chief, Camioate. And then the process is reversed. But then something remarkable happens. Next slide. Glad of an opportunity of being able to converse more intelligibly, Sacagawea was sent for. She came into the tent, sat down, and was beginning to interpret when in the person of Cameawait, she recognized her brother. She instantly jumped up and ran and embraced him, throwing over him her blanket and weeping profusely. After some conversation between them, she resumed her seat and attempted to interpret for us, but her new situation seemed to overpower her, and she was frequently interrupted by her tears. Okay, here's Sacagawea gives the lie to Lewis's snarky comment about her. Interestingly, Lewis never says anything about the intense reunion that he just witnessed or that he was wrong about Sacagawea. The conference confirms that the Corps will have to travel north to reach a native trail to take them through the mountains. But ever confident that they can do what the natives cannot, Clark makes a reconnaissance of the water route. On August 18th, Lewis turns 31, and he muses. This day I completed my 31st year and conceived that I had in all human probability now existed about half the period which I am to remain in this sublunary world. I reflected that I had as yet done but little, very little indeed, to further the happiness of the human race, or to advance the information of the succeeding generation. I viewed with regret the many hours I have spent in indolence, but since they are past, I dash from me the gloomy thought, and resolve to redouble my exertions, and in future to live for mankind as I have heretofore lived for myself. While Clark scouts, Lewis portages with the aid of Shoshone horses and women, the secondary beast of burden on the plains. One of the women who had been assisting in the transportation of, next one, baby. One of the women who had been assisting in the transportation of the baggage halted at a little run about a mile behind us. I inquired of Cameawait the cause of her detention, and was informed by him that she had halted to bring forth a child, and would soon overtake us. In about an hour, the woman arrived with a newborn babe, and passed us on her way to the camp, apparently as well as she ever was. Clark confirms that the salmon is indeed impassable. Lewis and Clark then have to bargain for horses, and of course the Shoshone then turn in the hard bargainers. Lewis and Clark manage to get 29 horses, some good, some bad, and they get a Shoshone familiar with the route to take them over the mountains. His name is Old Toby. Then they move over Lost Trail Pass. There's Lost Trail Pass, and one of the men says, "This day we passed over immense hills and some of the worst road that ever horses passed." Then they drop down into the Bitterroot Valley. Lost Trail Pass is but a taste of things to come. Though in the valley, travel becomes easier. They meet the Salish Indians, who have abundant horses, and the Corps manages to secure more. Their progress up the valley is generally without problem, but as they look to the left, the Bitterroot Mountains loom large and daunting when looking off to the west. Here, I'll give me that. You don't have to worry about it. At Traveler's Rest, Toby tells them they must turn west. Toby also informs Lewis and Clark about a road heading east, which would take them to the Great Falls in a few days. And this must have been extremely depressing news because it had taken them almost 2 months to get to this point. So, the biggest crisis of the expedition, they go over the Bitterroot Mountains. On September 11th, the Corps turns west and follows Lolo Creek up the mountains. Next slide. Back. There we go. The days will grow progressively awful. September 12th. The road through this hilly country is very bad, passing through steep hollows, past some most intolerable road on the sides of the steep, stony mountains. September 14th. The mountains today, much worse than yesterday, excessively bad and thickly strewed with falling timber, our men and horses much fatigued. September 15th. Several horses slipped. The one which carried my desk and small trunk turned over and rolled down a mountain for 40 yards and lodged against a tree, broke the desk. Because the hunters can find nothing and they feel like they are on the edge of starvation, they kill a colt for dinner. On the 16th, it begins to snow. The snow fell, next page, got it? Oh, yes. The snow fell so thick and the day was so dark that a person could not see to a distance of 200 yards. I have been wet and as cold in every part as I ever was in my life. Indeed, I was at one time fearful my feet would freeze in the thin moccasins. We encamped in a thickly timbered bottom, which was scarcely large enough for us to lie level, men all cold, wet, and hungry. One can only imagine what Sacagawea and the baby are going through, but there is no mention whatsoever of them in any of the journal entries in this time. Next slide. And that's presumably what it looked like. On the 18th, they're getting impatient. Clark, with several men, pushes on at greater speed. Later on that afternoon, Clark sees, and on the 19th, Lewis sees, a great prairie extending before them about 60 miles distant. Toby tells them there they will find the waters of the Columbia. September 19th. Fraser's horse fell from this road and rolled with his load near 100 yards into the creek. We all expected that the horse was killed, but to our astonishment, when the load was taken off him, he arose to his feet and appeared to be but little injured. This was the most wonderful escape I ever witnessed. On the 20th, Clark and his men reach the prairie and encounter the Nez Perce. The natives provide food, fish, and roots. On the 22nd, Lewis meets Reuben Field, who had been sent by Clark with food and directions. Clark has gone on ahead to scout the river. Next, there we go. The pleasure I now felt in having triumphed over the Rocky Mountains and descending to where there was every rational hope of finding a comfortable subsistence for myself and party could be more readily conceived than expressed. Nor was the flattering prospect of the final success of the expedition less pleasing. Interestingly, the Nez Perce at first do not trust the travelers, and they plan to kill them. But a woman who had been kidnapped earlier and then raised by whites convinced them to leave the travelers alone. And then they decided not to do it, and the Nez Perce became great allies. We won't talk about the history of the Nez Perce in here. The diet of fish and roots makes them very ill. Vomiting, excessive flatulence, and diarrhea are daily occurrences for 2 weeks. So, what did they eat? It is estimated that when abundant game was available, the men consumed up to 9 pounds of meat a day. If they had ample meat, they ate nothing else. Meat consisted of deer, elk, bison, bear, beaver, coyote, pronghorn, bighorn sheep, prairie dog, squirrel, and a lot more. We eat an immensity of meat. It requires 4 deer, or an elk and a deer, or 1 buffalo to supply us plentifully 24 hours. On occasion, they would net or catch fish, but it was not a major part of their diet, and they did not like salmon. Next slide. When food is scarce. When we halted for dinner, the squaw busied herself in searching for the wild artichokes. This operation she performed by penetrating the earth with a sharp stick. Her labor soon proved successful, and she procured a good quantity of these roots. Had nothing to eat but some portable soup. We being hungry for meat, as the soup did not satisfy, we killed a fat colt, which eat very well at this time. Oh, don't yet. Next slide. We divided the last of our dried meat at dinner. When it was consumed, we ate the balance of our dogs. While at dinner, an Indian fella very impertinently threw a half-starved puppy into the plate of Captain Lewis by way of derision for our eating dogs, and laughed very heartily at his own impertinence. Captain Lewis was so provoked that he caught the puppy and threw it with great violence at him. Okay. But here's the best. This is good. Save the best for last. Our cook, Charbonneau, makes the boudin blanc, one of the greatest delicacies of the forest. About 6 feet of the large gut is first morsel that the cook makes love to. This he holds fast at one end with the right hand, while with the forefinger and thumb of the left, he gently compresses it and discharges what he says is not good to eat. The muscle lying underneath the shoulder blade and fillets are kneaded up very fine, then added a just proportion of pepper and salt and a small quantity of flour. Our skillful operator, tying it fast at one end, begins with repeated evolutions of the hand and arm and a brisk motion of the finger and thumb to put in what he says is bon pour manger. When all is completely filled, It is tied at the other end, then baptized in the Missouri with 2 dips and a flirt, bobbed into the kettle. After it be well boiled, it is fried with bear's oil until it becomes brown, when it is ready to assuage the pangs of a keen appetite. Everybody's invited over for dinner tomorrow for that. Clark takes several men to the Clearwater to make canoes. Next one, there we go, thanks. Lewis brands their horses with, and leaves them turns them over to the Nez Perce, expecting to get them on the return journey. On October 8th, accompanied by Toby and a Nez Perce chief, loaded our canoes. At 16 miles just below one rapid canoe, in which Sergeant Gass was steering, nearly turning over. Bottom filled with water and sunk. The men, several of which could not swim, hung on to the canoe. I had one of the other canoes unloaded, and with the assistance of one Indian's canoe, took out everything and towed the empty canoe on shore. And thus begins the rushed travel down the rivers of the West. They're in a hurry to get to the Pacific. Clark notes this about the natives. Next one. Had everything opened and 2 sentinels put over them to keep off the Indians who are inclined to thieving. And here we see one of the many pejorative comments made about the natives, who one had basically saved their lives, and 2 enabled them to continue on the journey. Yet Clark also recognizes these people appeared disposed to give us every assistance in their power during our distress. Old Toby turns around, without their knowledge, and returns to the Shoshone. He is never heard from again and never collects the money that he's due for his services. On October 10th, they reach the Snake River. The Corps has begun to eat dog. From here on down the river, they purchase many dogs. And there you can see the Snake running up the loop on the right and then running into the Columbia on the way down. The green line will cover on, they take that route on the way back. Encountering some ferocious rapids, Clark notes that normally they would portage them, but due to the lateness of the year and the hurry that they were in, they chanced paddling them instead. For the most part, they run the rapids successfully, but they have accidents and lose gear. They reach the Columbia on the 16th, where they are entertained by Walla Wallas, Nez Perce relatives. This river in general is very handsome, except at the rapids where it is risking both life and property to pass. They encounter great numbers of natives along the river, all of whom are fishing for salmon. As they go on, they pass many native villages. At one village, they find the inhabitants trembling with fear. But then, as soon as they saw the squaw, they immediately all came out and appeared to assume new life. The sight of this Indian woman confirmed our friendly intentions, as no woman ever accompanies a war party in this quarter. The villages also continue to be numerous, as do the rapids. The non-swimmers are allowed to walk around them. Next one. They reach Celilo Falls on October 22nd and find ways to carry past this obstacle. They reach the short narrows and safely boat that. They reach the long narrows and boat that safely, both of them prodigious rapids to go through. They stop at the Dalles to rest and dry their gear and to repair their canoes. From here, they transition from the semi-arid eastern Oregon and Washington to the lush forests of the Cascades. The weather changes. The local tribes change, and both make life terribly unpleasant. Lewis and Clark see European trade goods and find that the natives are good capitalists, which bothers Lewis because he believes the natives have a duty to take compassion on the white travelers and give them material and food for nothing or virtually nothing. The Columbia becomes flat, then is affected by tides. They are getting close. But the weather turns terrible. It rains and rains and rains. On November 7th, from this particular spot, Clark says, "Great joy in camp. We are in view of the ocean, this great Pacific Ocean, which we have been so long anxious to see." Actually, Clark sees the estuary, not the ocean, but his joy cannot be diminished until the next day, when he notes, as they are stopped on the north bank of the Columbia, "We are all wet and disagreeable, as we have been for several days past, as we have not level land sufficient for an encampment and for our baggage to lie clear of the tide. The high hills jutting in so close and steep that we cannot retreat back. The waves are increasing to such a height that we cannot move from this place. We are compelled to form our camp between the height of the ebb and flood tides and raise our baggage on log. At this dismal niche, they cannot move and are battered by the rain and the driftwood. And meanwhile, next slide, the natives paddle in and out of the dismal niche, trying to sell the Corps food. These people left us and crossed the river through highest waves I ever saw a small vessel ride. Those Indians are certainly the best canoe navigators I ever saw. Yet they're considered savages, and the Corps, almost without question, refuses to learn from them. Next slide. It would be distressing to see our situation all wet and cold, our bedding also wet and a wet bottom, scarcely large enough to contain us, and canoes at the mercy of the waves. Finally, Lewis and a few men go around the point. The next day, the wind abates a little bit, and Clark takes his men around the point. They come to a place of greater comfort, but they had been stuck in the dismal niche for a week. And though this locale is better, it is not an ideal campsite. Next. Oh, how horrible is the day. Waves breaking with great violence against the shore, throwing the water into our camp, confined to our shelters. Then, on November 24th, an incredibly unique event takes place. They need a place to stay for the winter. Where should they stay? They have consulted the natives and their own experience. They could stay where they are, but on the north side of the river, but the weather and exposure have been dismal, and there hasn't been much in the way of game. They could proceed up the river, but they're afraid of how bad the winter is, and they don't have access to salt. Or they could go to the opposite bank of the Columbia, where supposedly elk abounded. One of the men notes, in the evening, our officers had the whole party assembled in order to consult which place would be the best for us to take up our winter quarters. One thing stands out about this process. Here is the journal record of the vote, partial record. Look at the last two names on the list. York, the slave, is given a vote. Sacagawea, the 17-year-old girl, is given a vote. Here, in the wilderness of unclaimed territory, both a black man and a teenage girl participate in the decision process. They cross the estuary. You can see they were where they were stuck was just to the right of station camp. They come across the estuary to start looking for another place to stay. They get stuck here again, and Clark says, it has been 24 days, next one. It has been 24 days since we arrived in sight of the great western, for I cannot say Pacific Ocean, as I have not seen one Pacific day since my arrival in its vicinity, and its waters tempestuous and horrible. They settle on high forested ground. They ultimately finish Fort Clatsop on Christmas Day. You can show the next one too. The several month stay here is dreary, as the weather is terrible. In 4 months, they have 12 days of sunshine. Food is sometimes scarce. The constant routine is boring. Several men are sent off to the coast to make salt. Others make clothing and moccasins. The captains complete their journals. Clark completes his map. They are terribly uncomfortable and constantly complain about how horrible the conditions are. Yet, the natives live here comfortably with minimal clothing and eat incredibly well on the products of the ocean and the river. They learn a whale has been beached south of the saltmakers' camp. So Clark sets out to buy as much meat as he can. But just before leaving, he is confronted with this. The Indian woman was very impatient to be permitted to go with me and was therefore indulged. She observed that she had traveled a long way with us to see the great waters, and that now that monstrous fish was also to be seen. She thought it very hard that she could not be permitted to see either. Clark and Sacagawea cross Tillamook Head and then go down to the whale. That's not the whale, that's the beach where the whale was. Clark buys some blubber and meat, but not nearly enough because he doesn't have enough money to pay for it. Then they reach a decision point. They had originally planned to turn around the first week of April, but impatience grows and grows as the discomfort at Fort Clatsop grows and grows. They have no trade goods to buy food. The elk moved out of range of the hunters. Needing a canoe, they buy one. Needing another canoe, they steal one. On March 23rd, 1806, they decide to leave. Next slide. The Corps gives it to the local tribe. At 12 o'clock, we were visited by Commonweal. To this chief we left our houses and furniture. He has been much more kind and hospitable to us than any other Indian in this neighborhood. Of course, he's giving them back their own property. This was always the natives' land, and they occupied it basically rent-free for the 4.5 months that they were there, all the while complaining that the natives stole their property. They returned upriver, passing many tribes that they had passed on the way downriver, and some sites, next one, that they hadn't seen on the way downriver, Cascades of the Columbia. They learned that the winter has been harsh, and that there will be little food available, either meat or salmon. This leaves the natives with too much time on their hands, and their hands a little bit too eager to take property of the expedition. This, of course, exasperates the Corps, but particularly Lewis, who, when his dog is stolen, sends men after the natives and says, "Kill any one of them if you don't get the dog back." He threatens to burn a village if a robe is not returned. You get the sense that each man would love to put his rifle to his shoulder and kill several of the natives. The thought that they were intruders never occurs to Lewis, Clark, or any of the men. By the time they reach the Dalles, they decide they have to go overland. Going upriver on the Columbia and on the Snake would have been terrible, which meant buying horses, which meant having to deal with the capitalistic natives, which meant more troublesome encounters with the natives. They have great difficulty in getting the horses, but ultimately get enough to carry their gear. But Clark uses some ingenuity in trying to get favorable trades. "Dress the sores of the principal chief. His wife, who I found to be a sulky bitch, was somewhat afflicted with pains in her back. This I thought a good opportunity to get her on my side. I rubbed a little camphor and applied warm flannel to her back, which she thought had nearly restored her to her former feelings. This I thought a favorable time to trade with the chief, who had more horses than all the nation besides. I accordingly made him an offer which he accepted and sold me 2 horses. Clark will use his skills as a physician all the way up to the Bitterroots. Lewis gets so frustrated that before they set out on foot and horse, I ordered all the spare poles, paddles, and the balance of our canoes put on the fire, as that not a particle should be left for the benefit of the Indians. When one of the natives tries to steal an iron socket from one of those poles, Lewis gave him several severe blows, which was the first act of this kind that had happened during the expedition. They gladly leave the area in which the Chinook tribes live. They keep going eastbound. They encounter the Walla Wallas and the Yakimas, who are not Chinooks, they're Nez Perce-related tribes, near the confluence of the Snake and Columbia. The reception is much more hospitable. They get food and wood, and they learn they can travel overland. Next slide. Overland, and that's the route that cuts off from the Snake River. So there's a lot of joy at this meeting. One night, Cruzat pulls out his fiddle, and the corpsmen dance for the Indians who love it. And then the local tribe gets up, all 350 of them, and dance for the Corps, which must have been very exciting for them to have a joyous encounter like that and brighten Lewis and Clark's outlook. As they proceed east, Clark continues to minister to the natives. These 2 cures has given those natives an exalted opinion of my skill as a physician. In our present situation, I think it pardonable to continue this deception, for they will not give us any provisions without compensation in merchandise, and our stock is now reduced to a mere handful. They reach the Clearwater. The Nez Perce return their horses. The great welcome is tempered by news that Lewis doesn't want to hear. The Bitterroots are impassable. They won't be ready till June or perhaps later, and it is May 7th. They do have welcome news, however. Their diet will change from dog to horse. They remain with the Nez Perce until June 10th. They have daily interactions with them, hunting, games, sexual encounters, Clark playing doctor, Lewis collecting information. But Lewis, and the 16-month-old Jean-Baptiste gets ill, and they carefully minister to him. But Lewis worries about what lies ahead. Having exhausted all our merchandise, we are obliged to have recourse to every subterfuge in order to meet that wretched portion of our journey, the Rocky Mountain. Our traders McNeil and York were furnished with the buttons which Captain C and myself cut off our coats, and small tin boxes. In the evening, they returned with about 3 bushels of roots and some bread, having made a successful voyage, not much less pleasing to us than the return of a good cargo to an East India merchant. And you can see how desperate they are by cutting their little brass buttons off their coats. Disregarding Nez Perce warnings that the trail is impassable, on June 10th, they start going up the mountains. But they find out very shortly that the trail is indeed impassable. Snow's 12 to 15 feet high. There's no trail for them. They do one thing they never wanted to do, and that's turn around. They come back to Wee Eye Prairie, which is the prairie that came, and where the Nez Perce were, and they secure several Nez Perce to guide them over the mountains. They leave again on June 24th. From this place, we had an extensive view of these stupendous mountains covered with snow. We were entirely surrounded. To one unacquainted with them, it would have seemed impossible ever to have escaped. Without the assistance of our guides, I doubt much whether we, who had once passed them, could find our way to Travelers' Rest. These fellows are the most admirable pilots. On 29th, they reached Lower Hot Springs, where everyone enjoys a warm bath. And then the next day, they come to Travelers' Rest. From here, next slide, from here they're going to split up. They plan to meet at the confluence of the Missouri and the Yellowstone rivers. Lewis and his contingent will go north and east, that brown line on there. Clark and his group, which will include York, Charbonneau, Sacagawea, and Jean-Baptiste, will head east and south. And so on July 3rd, 1806 begins the last stages of the expedition with entirely different results. Clark proceeds up the Bitterroot Valley, but just before they reach the horrible Lost Trail Pass, they bear to the east based on information they had received from the Salish. Then when they reach the height of land, the Indian woman informed me that she had been in this plain frequently and knew it well, that when we ascended the higher part of the plain, we would discover a gap in the mountains in our direction to the canoes. Following our directions, they reach Camp Fortunate, uncover the cache, and load the canoes. Some of the men paddle the canoes to the Three Forks, which must have been a delight after the upstream trip. Others ride horses. At the Three Forks, Ordway is put in charge of taking the canoes onto the Great Falls, the upper portage camp, where he would meet Lewis's contingent. Clark sets out to find the Yellowstone. As they head toward the Yellowstone, next one, the Indian woman who has been great, this is the Gallatin leading there. The Indian woman who was, next slide, the Indian woman who has been of great service to me as a pilot through this country recommends a gap in the mountains more south, which I shall cross. Next one. And they passes Bozeman Pass. So they cross over Bozeman Pass, and then they reach the Yellowstone. Clark orders 2 canoes to be built. That night, half the horses are stolen, probably by the Crow. Clark gives Sergeant Pryor and 3 other men the remaining horses, and a letter with a special mission. Then on July 24th, Clark lashes the 2 canoes together, hops in the canoes, and starts down the swift Yellowstone. Pryor and his 3 men making overland journey. Second night out, all their horses are stolen. They return back to the Yellowstone. They make 2 bull boats, hop in the bull boats, and chase after Clark. Clark reaches the confluence of the Missouri on August 3rd. He is supposed to wait for Lewis there, but the mosquitoes are atrocious, and they drive him down the river. 5 days later, Pryor and his men catch up to Clark. On August 12th, Lewis and his men appear with 2 incredible stories. Following the advice of his Nez Perce guides, Lewis takes his men north on the Bitterroot to where the Blackfoot River flows into it. Of these Nez Perce, Sergeant Gass says, "It is but justice to say that the whole nation are the most friendly, honest, and ingenuous people that we have seen in the course of our voyage." They proceed along the Blackfoot River, which leads them to the Great Falls, and then they reach the upper portage camp on July 11th. From here, Lewis plans to take 7 men with him to explore the Marias, to extend the scope of the Louisiana Purchase. The others would wait for Ordway to arrive. But in the night, many of their horses are stolen. And Lewis does not have enough mounts to take 7 men. So he leaves for the Marias country and the Blackfoot country, and the Blackfoot are the most tenacious tribe on the plains, with only 3 men, Druyer and the Fields brothers. Now, Sergeant Gass and Ordway execute the portage with the help of horses this time in only 6 days. They set out on the Missouri, and then on July 28th, as they reach the Marias, they see an amazing sight, galloping horsemen. Back to July 16th. Lewis, Druyer, and the Fields head off to the Marias. But Lewis quickly realizes that the Marias flow from the west, not from the north. So he quickly abandons that, turns around, and heads back towards the Missouri. On July 26th, Lewis spies several Blackfoot. Looking at Druyer, who's walking off several hundred yards away, Lewis becomes concerned. He approaches the natives, and ultimately any perceived threat is diffused. The 4 corpsmen and the 8 Blackfoot sit down, they sit, they smoke, they converse, they decide to spend the night together. Lewis and Druyer sleep in the Blackfoot shelter, Fields sleep outside, each man is supposed to take a watch. In the morning, Lewis is awakened by a scuffle. The natives have seized the men's guns and start to run off. Reuben Field, fastest man of the group, runs after his Indian, grabs him, grabs his gun, takes his knife, stabs the Indian in the heart, and the Blackfoot dies on the spot. Drewer manages to retrieve his gun. Lewis runs after the man who takes his gun, draws his pistol, and the Blackfoot drops his gun and runs away. The Blackfoot then try to drive off Lewis's horses. Lewis pursues them, and when one of the natives turns on him with a gun, Lewis shoots and hits him in the belly. The Blackfoot goes down. He has a gun. He raises the gun, and just before he dies, he shoots at Lewis, and Lewis feels the bullet whizzing right by his head. Lewis returns to the camp. The Blackfoot horses are still there. Before they leave the scene, they take the Blackfoot horses, of course. Before they leave the scene, while the men were preparing the horses, I put 4 shields and 2 bows and quivers of arrows on the fire. They had but 2 guns, and one of them they left. The gun we took with us. I also retook the flag which I had given them as a gift, but left the medal around the neck of the dead man, where they might be informed who we were. They bolt like hell across the Montana prairie, afraid that other Blackfoot warriors might be pursuing them. They ride uninterrupted for 63 miles. They stop for an hour and a half, then ride another 17 miles, stop for 2 hours, always looking behind them. No one was chasing them. Then, next one. We traveled until 2 o'clock in the morning, having come, by my estimate, after dark, about 20 miles. We laid ourselves down to rest in the plain, very much fatigued. My Indian horse carried me much better than my own would have done, and leaves me with but little reason to complain of the robbery. If you weren't adding, they covered 100 miles in that stretch. When they arise at daybreak, I was so sore from my ride yesterday that I could scarcely stand, and the men complained of being in a similar situation. However, I encouraged them by telling them that our own lives, as well as those of our friends, depended on our exertions at this moment. They were alert, soon prepared the horses, and we again resumed our march. As they near the Missouri on July 28th, they hear gunfire. At the edge of the river, next one. At the edge of the river, the canoes hove into view. They are reunited with the rest of their team and are safe in their numbers. Lewis releases the horses, boards the canoes, and breathes a great sigh of relief and heads down to his rendezvous with Clark at the confluence. When he arrives at the Yellowstone on August 7th, he does not find Clark, only the remnant of a note that telling him that Clark went downriver to escape the mosquitoes. Lewis pursues Clark's party, but on August 11th, he decides to stop to hunt. Lewis and Cruzat kill one elk and wound another. They both go in search of the wounded elk, Lewis in one direction, Cruzat in the other direction. Lewis sees the wounded elk, raises his rifle, and just as he's about to fire, he's shot in the buttocks by Cruzat. Cruzat is blind in one eye and mistakes Lewis, who's walking around the bush in animal skin clothing, for an elk, for the wounded elk. The shot passes entirely through one cheek, and the ball lodges in Lewis's pants. If you know caliber, it's a .54 caliber bullet. It's about a ½ inch around or across. Lewis, with the assistance of Sergeant Gass, I took my clothes and dressed my wounds myself, introducing tents of patent lint into the ball holes. The wounds bled considerably, but I was happy to find that it had touched neither bone nor artery. Though luckily unlucky, Captain Lewis is compelled to travel downriver by lying on his belly. The next day they meet 2 trappers who tell them that Lewis and Clark are just downriver. On the afternoon of August 12th, the whole party is reunited, but Clark, of course, is much worried about the wounded Captain Lewis. They proceed on to the Mandan villages. Here, John Coulter leaves the expedition and will become one of the most foremost mountain men of the West. Here they deposit Charbonneau, Jean-Baptiste, and Sacagawea. Charbonneau gets paid. Lewis later refers to Charbonneau as a man of no peculiar merit. But Clark will write to Charbonneau, You have been a long time with me and have conducted yourself in such a manner as to gain my friendship. Your woman who accompanied you that long, dangerous, and fatiguing route to the Pacific Ocean and back deserved a greater reward for her services than we had in our power to give her. As to your little son, You well know my fondness for him and my anxiety to take and raise him as my own child. This must have been a bittersweet parting for the four of them, but they would continue to stay in touch. And indeed, Clark will raise Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau, who also becomes one of the legendary figures of the West, who last lived in Auburn, California, and just before he undertook the journey to Oregon, and he died in 1866. The river conveys them quickly downstream, ultimately coming into contact with white civilization. The first people, they say, stare at them. You guys are supposed to be dead. Everybody thinks you're dead. Here we are. We're not dead. But imagine the best thing that happens to them when they encounter these traders. They get what they haven't had for a year. Whiskey. Then they reach St. Louis. Last slide. September 23rd, 1806. A wet, disagreeable morning. We set out after breakfast and proceeded on. About 12 o'clock, we arrived in sight of St. Louis, fired 3 rounds. The people gathered on the shore and huzzaed 3 cheers. We drew out the canoes. Then the party all rejoiced that we have the expedition completed. We intend to return to our native homes to see our parents once more, as we have been so long from them. And so ends the epic journey. Then, September 26th, a fine morning, we commenced writing. And what did they write? Over 1 million words in the journals of the Lewis and Clark expedition. No, I'm not going to try. I was going to put this on, but 1, it's too hot, and 2, it'd take me about 5 minutes to do it. But more of my stuff. Okay, I'll take questions from, we have time for some questions, I believe. Yes, where's Peter? Where's my note? Oh, there. That's thank you. Yeah, oh yeah, I thought this, oh my God. This is a lost instruction from President Jefferson. This is advice to the Lewis and Clark expedition. If you see a band of aggressive warriors near the golden Pacific Ocean, do not treat them cavalierly. Okay, all right, good. Okay, there was a question.
You have all the journals up here, but there's some gaps in the journals of fairly long periods. And I was wondering if you had an opinion about what may have happened to those.
Well, there's no gaps in Clark's journal. There's gaps in Lewis's journals. And one conjecture is that they're lost. I don't think they're lost. I just don't think. He writes journals as they go down the Ohio River. Then he stops when he gets up on the Mississippi. And he doesn't start until they get up to the Mandan villages. Because he was charged with the responsibility of doing all this scientific work. He turns over all the navigational stuff to Clark. He's doing all the ethnographic and the natural history stuff. And everything that's there, or at least up to that point, is material that has been seen previously by white men. So he doesn't keep them then. He's also moody. So he has moments where his moodiness gets to him. After he's shot in the ass, he can't sit and write. So that's a problem. There are a couple of lost journals. What you don't get in the journals, and this go back to that first entry where Lewis almost falls off a 300-foot cliff and stops himself with his knife. Well, wouldn't you want to know more about that? He just said, oh yeah, he almost fell, stopped himself with his knife. Oh yeah, guy almost died. And that's it. You don't get a description of any of the men who are on there. There's no really personality development. You get a look at Sacagawea because when she does stuff, they mention it, but again, Lewis doesn't like Sacagawea. Lewis doesn't like Charbonneau. He'd just as soon not have them with them. And the journal is very frustrating that way. There is additional material that you supplement the journal. Number one, when they were in the Mandan villages, They wrote a lot of material that's not in the journals. They wrote letters to Jefferson. Clark wrote to his brothers. One of his brothers is George Rogers Clark, and his other brother Jonathan Clark, both Revolutionary War heroes. A lot of recorded material there. There are Canadian traders at the Mandan villages, and they write things about Lewis and Clark. They like Clark, they don't like Lewis. No surprise. So you get supplementary information going up to the Mandan villages. What you don't get is going westward unless you give credence to Native American information. But don't forget, they don't meet anybody till they meet the Shoshones on the other side of the Continental Divide. And so there are stories more among the Nez Perce, for example, than among the Shoshone. But the Shoshone, they all have oral histories which supplement the information as well. So yes, it's frustrating. And there are 2 lost journals, which is also frustrating. Stan.
Was the keel boat sent back from the halfway point with exhibits?
Yes, the keel boat was loaded with all the material that they had collected up through the winter, which included the prairie dog and the magpie.
So a couple members of the...
They start off with the 2 captains, the 25 so-called permanent party, 6 extra soldiers, and 8 engagés. The engagés go back, the extra soldiers go back. There's changes in the permanent party because a couple of guys, quote, mutinied or were court-martialed, and there are swaps. So there's 31 men, Sacagawea and Jean-Baptiste for 33. But yes, those go back. Colonel Richard Worthington takes it back, yes.
Once they reached the ocean, was there any chance they would use the ocean to get back?
Jefferson gave them a letter of credit, the most open letter of credit ever issued by the American government, which basically said, we'll pay you anything to take these guys back, or some of them. They did expect or hope to meet a ship because boats had come in and obviously traded with the natives there. They were hoping for a boat to show up. Actually, a boat did show up a couple of weeks after they left. They would have put at least a couple of men on the boat, if not all of them, if they thought they could. But that would have been a hell of a voyage too, because you have to go all the way around South America and come back up. Yes.
After they returned, what happened? I mean, what did Jefferson do with all of this information? And were there follow-on plans?
Well, I got to tell you, that would take me 15 minutes to tell you the story. Briefly, Lewis was in charge of the journals and did nothing with them. And Lewis ultimately commits suicide. So it's on Clark and George Shannon to finish up the journals. I mean, that's as brief as you can get. And, okay, and the answer to all those questions and more is that. That. If this whetted your appetite, there are the dates, there's the place, there's the time. I'll be doing this 10 hours instead of 1 hour and 25 minutes. And there's an enormous amount of detail, obviously, that's left out that I can cover much greater detail in that time frame. So thank you.
Okay, thank you.